Hello, my name is Andreas Önnerfors, and I am the Worshipful Master of the Lodge of Quatuor Coronati, number 2076 in the United Grand Lodge of England. I'm going to present to you today my lecture called Masonic Diplomacy in London around 1800, Interactions between Swedish and English Freemasonry in Times of Crisis. I'm going to share my presentation with you, so that you can see what I'm going to talk about. I am a professor in the history of sciences and ideas at the University of Gothenburg, and a lot of my papers are available on my academia.edu account. I'm also a member of the Swedish research lodge called Swedish-English of the Swedish Rite, and carry the degree 10 in the provincial lodge of Scania, also of the Swedish Rite. And the topic today that I'm going to explore is exactly about the relationships between Sweden and England, or precisely the Swedish Order of Freemasons and the modest Grand Lodge. So my own research into Freemasonry has been channeled into a book published by Oxford University Press called Freemasonry, a very short introduction, that came out 3 years ago at OUP. And it is characterized on a reading list about Masonic books as "No words are wasted in this very short but excellent book by historian Önnerfors, the best starting point for anyone's investigation into the subject." And my ambition is, of course, that I once upon a time would have time to write a book about the history and origin of the Swedish Rite as well, where this paper I'm going to present today could be one of the chapters and episodes that I'm going to talk about. So what will I talk about today? I will talk you through one specific year in Masonic history, 1799, and explain to you why that year is very relevant. And before I will come into the more inner content of my paper, I will say something about the Swedish-English Masonic relations during the 18th century until the Union of 1813. Then I will talk about the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799 in its European context, and the Unlawful Societies Act being that particular piece of legislation that almost had banned Freemasonry in the country of its origin. Then I will talk about the Swedish Masonic diplomatic initiative and the person behind it, the Swedish envoy Silfverhielm, and his mission in London in that year, and his contacts with the modest Grand Lodge. Then I will talk about the Swedish rapprochement and its aftermath in Freemasonry and politics, and say some final words about overlapping diplomacies, Freemasonry, and soft politics, as it is called in political sciences. So to start with the letter sent by the Prince of Wales to Duke Charles of Sudermania in Sweden, signed on the 8th of May 1799. This is the letter that is preserved in the Swedish Order of Freemasons in the archive. And as you can see here, it is both signed and sealed by the Prince of Wales, and written in French. And it was addressed to the Grand Master of the Swedish Order of Freemasons, Duke Charles of Sudermania. So when I talk about Duke Charles, it is this person I'm talking about. He later on became King of Sweden between 1809 and 1818, a very transformative period in Swedish history. And he became also King of Norway between 1814 and 1818, Norway being united with Sweden through a personal union after 1814, after the Vienna Congress. He was the Grand Master of the Swedish Order of Freemasons almost for 4 decades, and influenced its development profoundly. Those of you who are not familiar with higher degree Freemasonry will find this image challenging to understand, but the Swedish Rite has three distinct levels, one being the craft degrees, the other called the Scottish degrees, and the third and highest and supreme level being the chapter degrees, where, as you can see, Knights Templar imagery is very prominent. And I will come back to the Swedish Rite's obsession with the Knights Templar imagination later on. So what does the letter say? It says it's a reply to a letter from Duke Charles in which he proposes a closer union between the two Grand Lodges. Now, that letter was read out at the quarterly communications of the Modernist Grand Lodge on the 30th of April, so a couple of weeks before that reply, and had already been signed almost a year earlier. I will come back to that particular letter. What the Prince of Wales says is that the order of Freemasons is in both countries, quote, founded on the good of humanity. And it's important to preserve that simplicity which has distinguished the order for so many centuries, he also says. Moreover, it is vital to proscribe those novelties which furnish material for those dangerous enthusiasts or wicked conspirators working under the cover of darkness and the sacred veil of our order. And there are three principles to be followed in Freemasonry: the adoration of the Almighty, the submission to the government of our native country, and love for our neighbor. Moreover, the Prince of Wales points to the royal protection Freemasonry has in both Britain and in Sweden. So what is behind that rhetoric in that letter? That is exactly what I'm going to explain to you, because it must be read in the context of the passing of a piece of legislation that almost had Freemasonry banished in the country of its origin, Britain. But first, I'm going to say something about the Swedish-English Masonic relations during the 18th century until 1813. Because one can ask the question, why would Duke Charles, the Grand Master of Sweden, propose a closer union between the Grand Lodges? And the background is the following, that the first initiation on Swedish soil took place in 1735, 2 years after Sweden received a constitution from the French Grand Lodge to exercise Masonic authority over the Kingdom of Sweden. This constitution was renewed in 1751, and finally in 1760, when the right amount of lodges was present, the Grand Lodge of Sweden was established formally. Then, over the next decade, there was a conflict of interest with an English diplomat, Tullman's lodges, who had received patents from the Modernist Grand Lodge. They were established in Stockholm and in Gothenburg at the west coast. So Tullman claimed that he had the authority to establish a provincial Grand Lodge of Sweden, and was of the opinion that the Swedish Grand Lodge was not constituted legally. In that situation, the Swedish Grand Master, Count Schäfer, contacted the modern Grand Master for foreign Grand Lodges, de Vignol, who was a Frenchman living in London, to sort out that conflict. And the conflict was solved in correspondence between Schäfer and de Vignol. De Vignol, for his part, said that the Swedish constitutions were to be seen as illegal, and Tullman closed down his provincial Grand Lodge of Sweden and his lodges in Sweden. But after that, there was almost no contact between Sweden and England until 1784. And then suddenly Sweden became more interested in England and English Freemasonry at the end of the 1790s. Well, if we look at the reasons behind that, it is very easy to see that this follows geopolitical alignments. Sweden, since the day of the 30 Years' War, had an alliance, the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, had an alliance with the Catholic Kingdom of France, which it followed strictly in foreign politics. So when moving into the 18th century and looking at the geopolitical development then, Sweden was always on the side of France. For instance, in the 7 Years' War, for instance, supporting French initiatives for American independence, for instance, being the second country in the world in diplomatically recognizing the United States. And Sweden had reasons to be angry at the United Kingdom or Britain because Sweden had possessions in the old German Empire, so had the new Hanoverian crown. So Sweden sided during the 18th century with the Jacobites in trying to get back its territory on German soil, and also to promote the Jacobite cause, which again can be seen as one part of French foreign politics. So also in Freemasonry, Sweden followed France and was not so much concerned about England until the end of the 1790s, when this new renewed sudden Swedish interest comes. And this, of course, is as such caused by the political development. First, I'm going to show you some documents. These are the first Swedish rules and regulations from 1737. And as you can see, they're signed by the Jacobite Count Derwentwater and by Maclean, who both were very prominent in the Jacobite circles in Paris. So here are also pictures from the correspondence between de Vignol, who was acting as the Grand Master of Foreign Lodges on behalf of the Modernist Grand Lodge in London. Without doubt, de Vignol says that the Swedish Grand Lodge, that the constitution of the Swedish Grand Lodge is to be seen as legal and thus valid. But then the next time London wants to know something about Sweden is 14 years later, when they send this letter that you can see here. And Sweden also replies to that letter politely, but more or less nothing happens. So let me now move into the crucial year of 1799 and explain what happens in Britain in the European context. Well, 1799 is exactly 10 years after the French Revolution. And the British Parliament passes an act that is called the Unlawful Societies Act, which basically bans all kinds of associations which can pose a threat to the existing political order. So as a response to growing societal and political tensions, this legislation is passed to stem radical activism in the aftermath of the French Revolution. This is a period that sees a number of Irish uprisings and finally an Irish rebellion, and organizations like the United Irishmen, Scotsmen, Englishmen, or the Radical Enlightenment London Greetings Society popping up, promoting radical Enlightenment messages. And arguably the United Irishmen being the first radical organization promoting the Irish cause. This piece of legislation is, however, also influenced by the growth of anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, in particular the Abbé Baruel, who is an exiled French priest who writes his memoirs of the history of Jacobinism, in which he attacks Freemasonry and other secret societies, and the Edinburgh Professor Robison, who writes a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy, where he likewise blames certain forms of continental Freemasonry of promoting a revolutionary radical Enlightenment agenda. However, what most frequently is missed out is to place the Unlawful Societies Act into the European context. And one particular piece of legislation that we should keep in mind was passed 1 year earlier in Prussia in 1798. It's called the Freimaurer Edict. And in fact, the Prussian edict goes back to regulation of Freemasonry in Austria the Habsburg Empire from 1786, which basically places Freemasonry under the patronage or control of the Habsburg Emperor, and stretching back to a regulation, a royal regulation in Denmark from 1780, which is one of the first instances in claiming that Freemasonry only can be exercised within national borders. And also after 1799, we have regulations like in Sweden itself, that in 1803 passed a royal regulation of fraternal orders, placing them under governmental surveillance, and an outright prohibition in Russia in 1822. So if we put all these government regulations together on the scale between governmental protection or governmental regulation, prohibition of certain forms of fraternal associations, such as in Prussia and in Britain 1799, and outright prohibition like in Russia, we can see a pattern that governments are uncertain about the idea and the praxis of voluntary association in the age of revolution and reaction. And that means basically that a voluntary association is suddenly perceived as a threat. Whereas throughout the largest part of the 18th century, fraternal life, fraternal orders and associations are part and parcel of the movement of enlightenment. This receives a far more darker twist at the end of the century, as we can see. So here you can see the title page of the Prussian edict from 1798 that I won't be able to talk about more today, but I would say it's highly interesting because there are very many overlaps to the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799, in which Freemasonry actually was exempted from regulation, but still it would fulfill most of the criteria for prohibition, like being a society where you have to take an oath, where you perhaps don't know the superiors, and which is organized in different branches across the country. So, but I won't talk more about the Unlawful Societies Act. Andrew Prescott has written a fascinating and extensive paper that is covering all aspects about the birth and development of the Unlawful Societies Act, which actually was a piece of legislation in place until 1967 in Britain. So I leave the Unlawful Societies Act there for you, and just want to say something more about the background, which is anti-Masonry in Britain during the 1790s. Abbé Baruel, who I mentioned previously, said that Freemasonry is to blame for orchestrating radical political change in Europe, but definitely in France. And Professor Robinson in Edinburgh publishes this book, Proofs of Conspiracy Against All Religions and Governments of Europe, carried out in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and reading societies, where he in particular targets continental forms of Freemasonry, in particular higher degree Freemasonry, as a perverted form of Freemasonry, which contributes to the excess of revolution. In a sort, as a counter stunt, British Freemasonry engages into publishing the Freemasons magazine, which is a journal that I've written about extensively, and which came out between 1793 and the crucial year 1799. Because in the Freemasons magazine, you can see how British Freemasonry attempts to counter the growing trend of anti-Masonry by referring to historical cases such as the suffering of Custos and other Portuguese Inquisition, and also bringing forward arguments against Robinson and Baruel, and at the same time displaying extreme loyalty and patriotism in relationship to the British throne and the British government. So here, for instance, in the very first issue of the Freemasons magazine, there is a loyal address to the king by the Modern Grand Lodge, and also in the same issue, a narrative of the extraordinary proceedings of the Inquisition of Portugal against the Freemasons. So basically capturing the entire topic into a logic of patriotic support for the crown, and pointing at that the persecution of Freemasonry is based upon superstition and suspicion and conspiracy, basically. That is how I interpret the editorial program of the Freemasons magazine in this regard, at least. Well, now, what about the Swedes in this big picture? I'm going to talk quite a lot about the Swedish diplomat Silfverhielm and his career. As you can see, the name of this man is spelled in very different ways. So you might find him in the archive material under very different varieties of his name, which is nothing in common during the period. People themselves sometimes spell their names in different ways, and sometimes people also don't know how to spell my name. So I don't blame them if they didn't know how to spell Silfverhielm correctly. Göran Ulrik Silfverhielm was a Swedish diplomat who mainly served in Britain, first as a secretary of the Swedish envoy, then as a chargé des affaires, then a minister resident, then an envoyé extraordinaire, and finally a ministre plénipotentaire. He was, during a period of his life, married to a lady called Harriet Matthew, and her family was very prominent in London as patrons of the art. And maybe they had contacts to the circles around Blake and other authors and artists of the period. Göran Silfverhielm became a member of Duke Charles' intimate circle in Freemasonry and also other fraternal orders. So he was a perfect person for him to choose for a Masonic mission to Britain. And when it was became public that Silfverhielm would go over to Britain again in 1789, there were two instructions issued to Silfverhielm about his Masonic mission. One open instruction that basically was about go there, establish nice connections to the Modern Grand Lodge, try to find out everything about Freemasonry in Britain, and be polite and kind, and let us know what is going on there and how they look upon Swedish Freemasonry. But then there was this secret instruction that I also talk about in my paper. And the most delicate paragraph I translated for you here in full text. So that is refers to Silfverhielm, is obliged on all occasions to avoid the alleged supremacy or superiority which English Freemasonry generally wants to exercise over the lodges of other countries. And since the Swedish Grand Lodge has never accepted the precedence from the English, such disputes are to be avoided diligently. But if such unexpectedly occur, the envoy of the Swedish Grand Lodge should clearly declare that, since it owns its power and authority from a completely different place from England, it can also not accept the precedence of its Grand Lodge. It, Sweden, constitutes a particular province, independent from the English, and shares no other interest than that which promotes a close friendship and which is stated by the uniformity of the aims of its practices. So the background behind these formulations in the Swedish instruction are discussed extensively in my paper, but to mention them shortly, Sweden imagined itself being an independent province of the Masonic Order of Knights Templar, and since the Swedish Rite, the origin of which are shrouded in mystery, came to Sweden through Geneva, that we know for sure, and maybe is of North Italian or origin, or from Avignon. We actually don't know that yet, exactly. Sweden imagined that it has an authority that was independent from England. And if you look at the development of the 18th century, you can see that Swedish Masonic leaders actually believed that this was the case. So they constructed their own authority, mainly related to higher degree Freemasonry, which the modern Grand Lodge anyhow not was particularly concerned with. But which might have been a reason why, or some developers in Britain might have been the reason why Sweden wanted to know more, because in the 1790s sees also the rise of Knights Templar Freemasonry in Britain. So this is the instruction that already was signed in January 1798, so more than a year before Silfverhielm actually arrived to Britain in late that year or early 1799. He arrived to London. But then you can also see a strange certificate that was issued to Duke Ulrich Silfverhielm as the Swedish Masonic envoy to Britain. And I'm talking extensively about this strange certificate in my paper, but as you can see, the certificate as such has not so much to do with mainstream craft Freemasonry, but rather with something else. And what that something else actually is, and why Duke Charles found it appropriate to provide Silfverhielm with that particular certificate is still shrouded in some mystery. I discuss some potential interpretations for that in my paper. But as you can see, the imagery clearly relates to a form of Freemasonry that sees itself as a continuation of the chivalric orders of the Middle Age, and not the least the Jerusalem order as well, or as it is said here, the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Well, another intriguing and thought-provoking and very interesting aspect of the Swedish diplomatic initiative is the correspondence between Duke Charles and Silfverhielm, because the letters between Duke Charles and Silfverhielm was coded or written in a particular cipher that was decoded with this grill that you can see on the slide here. And that means, which is a rather sophisticated way of coding letters, I have learned, because you need to know how to turn this grill, and then you put in the different parts and symbols of certain words on a paper. And without the right solution, this is a pretty hard code to crack. So the question is, of course, why did Duke Charles ask his diplomat in London to code letters on Freemasonry in this particular fashion? There might be several reasons. I mean, when they are talking about diplomatic issues that kind of are open secrets or even, you know, sensitive topics for the Swedish state, they are not using the cipher. They're only using it when they write about Freemasonry. And Duke Charles did that with a number of his correspondents. He went to the continent to take the baths in Karlsbad or Karlovy, and went to Vienna. And during 1.5 years at least, he used this form of cipher with a number of his Swedish contacts. So it was pretty hard to decipher. Fortunately, I found most of the letters are deciphered by Duke Charles, and the dispatch was transcribed from this grill. As you can see here, this is the handwriting of Duke Charles himself, and it looks not very clear, but it is actually very clear. And after a while, you easily can grasp his handwriting. But for instance, this letter is actually this part of that is transcribed. And then if you translate that passage to English, it reads the following. Freemasonry, which since my last stay in England, probably during the 1790s, this is Silfverhielm speaking now, in a rather unimportant way was acknowledged by the public, has since that time in a high degree turned into a topic of diligent and curious public interest, and even more of closer investigation by the government. Two learned, the one a Scotsman with the name of Robison, professor in Edinburgh. The other Frenchman called Baruel, an ex-Jesuit, have both within a year, and each in his own language, published writings accusing Freemasonry to be the breeding ground and nursery for the present teachings of revolution, destroying all societal order and legitimate government. With a certain but insufficient acquaintance of the true secret of Freemasonry, both have united a more true and extensive knowledge of Illuminatism. It is spelled like that in the letter. Both of its atheistic type from Bavaria, the head of which was a Weishaupt, as well as of the mystical, which as its tool has used the Cagliostro or Pater Gassner, as well as other publicly known charlatans. How finally these two types of Illuminati, as a vehicle to transport their systems, have gained access to the secret of Freemasonry, and in particular for this purpose have exploited its three craft degrees, has been known by these above-mentioned authors. But such a knowledge has then been applied by them without differentiation to throw a shadow on the entire order of Freemasons, and in particular its higher secrets. French Freemasonry, and particularly its operations under the rule of the Duke of Orléans, has been cited by Baruel as evidence for the activity of the entire order to bring about the present revolution of society. Although correct knowledge of the matter takes off all suspicion from the hazard posed to societies and religion by the Masonic order, if perceived as such in the right way, it is at the same time less surprising that the fear of the profane world has been awakened by these crippled but partly evidenced facts on the misuse that was caused by certain forms of Freemasonry. And then, of course, you wonder why Silfverhielm put so much effort in transcribing this passage with this particular piece of coding. But here you can see what the correspondence between Silfverhielm and Duke Charles actually was about. I would say it's a high level and very initiated information about Freemasonry, and later on also political affairs, as I would say. Upon this, Duke Charles replied to Silfverhielm and said, "Yes, I know about these writings because I have recently read a book in which I was accused of murdering my own brother, or at least orchestrating the murder of my own brother, King Gustav III. He was also Freemason, by the way, in 1792. Most likely, Duke Charles referred to work Le Tomb of Jaques Molay, which outlines a vast conspiracy against society, in fact, the humanity as a whole, carried out by a murderous sect of superhuman men surviving since the days of the Assassins and Knights Templar. And that is the book, Le Tomb of Jaques Molay, and it's a very fascinating title plate. I write in my paper extensively about this, and I have also a forthcoming publication treating Le Tomb of Jaques Molay more in detail. But it is in fact one of the blueprints of both Baruel and Robison, which also has been observed. And more importantly, the book mentions Duke Charles. It mentions the Duke of Orléans, and it talks about the Masonic Knights Templars as some form of revolutionary organization extending across the European continent. So it's a very small, it's a very obscure book, but it is very important to understand the anti-Masonic writings of both Baruel and Robison in the 1790s, and why somebody would be able to imagine that Duke Charles actually was on the side of the French Revolution, which on first sight, of course, appears to be completely absurd, because he's a royal, because he's a member of a Knights Templar Freemasonry, which on the other hand could be interpreted as something very conservative or even backwards looking. Well, in the end, I'll explain how Silfverhielm managed to make contact, Silverhielm is received by the Modern Grand Lodge at the quarterly communications, the 10th of April, 1799. He makes contact with the acting Grand Master, the Earl of Moira, or Lord Rawdon, as he also is called later on, and is very successful. He makes friends with them. He reads out the letter from Duke Charles to the Grand Lodge, where the closer union between the two Grand Lodges is proposed. He takes part in the dinner. He's made an honorary member of Grand Lodge. And in William Preston's illustrations of Masonry, this entire event was after that described as follows: from the above correspondence and the happy opening of a regular communication between the Grand Lodge of England, Scotland, and Sweden, there is the greatest reason to believe that the best effect will result, and that, agreeably to the wish of every zealous brother, a friendly and lasting intercourse will be preserved with the Freemason of all the kingdoms. So Silverhielm obviously is successful in his diplomatic rapprochement or approach to Grand Lodge. And the question is why? One reason might, of course, be that the modest Grand Lodge was simply happy that another European Grand Lodge approached them and said, we want to become your friends, we want to have a closer union. But why this reception in the Grand Lodge? Why at this point in time? Why reading out the letter of Duke Charles in the lodge? Why making Silverhielm an honorary member of Grand Lodge? And that explanation, of course, lies exactly in the dates. And as I explained in my paper, this is down to, if you know what happens during the time, there is a governmental bill proposed which might outlaw Freemasonry in Britain. And British Freemasonry desperately needs something that it can use in its negotiations with Prime Minister Pitt. And Silverhielm, in his dispatches, writes things to Duke Charles that not have been known in British history before. We know that George III, who was the king, but he was very sick and mentally unstable, to say the least, and his Prime Minister Pitt were opposed to the Prince of Wales and the opposition leader Fox. But then from the correspondence between Silverhielm and Duke Charles, it emerges that Lord Moira, who was the acting Grand Master of the modern Grand Lodge, potentially would become a prime minister in the case that George III would pass away. And in that sense, not only the Prince of Wales and Moira were the political opponents of Prime Minister Pitt, but indirectly Freemasonry as well. So what Silverhielm writes in his correspondence to Duke Charles is that the reason why Pitt targeted Freemasonry was not only that it was sort of related to those organizations the Unlawful Society Act actually wanted to ban, but that one of the true reasons might be that he wanted to use the discussion about the prohibition of Freemasonry in his negotiations about the domestic politics in Britain. So that's a quite extraordinary claim, and I quote Silverhielm's correspondence extensively in my paper. So what was the aftermath of the Swedish rapprochement? Well, according to Silverhielm, the letter by Duke Charles was not only well received by the modern Grand Lodge, but was used by Lord Moira in negotiating exemptions from the Unlawful Societies Act for Freemasonry on the 2nd May of 1799. And that was a meeting between Lord Athol, Lord Moira, and the Scottish Grand Master, or at least a representative of the Scottish Grand Lodge, with Prime Minister Pitt, in which they discussed about the exemptions from legislation. And according to Silverhielm, the letter by Duke Charles was produced, shown as a token of a good faith in the negotiations with the government. But the delicacy surrounding the passing of the entire act must, of course, be understood in the tense relationship between the Prime Minister Pitt, George III, the Prince of Wales as successor to the throne, and Lord Moira as a potential candidate for the post of Prime Minister in case of George III's death. So Silverhielm's dispatches provide with another piece in the puzzle as to why Prime Minister Pitt might have targeted Freemasonry. And that is the kind of extraordinary twist to this entire story, I would say. So domestic politics, internal power play, uses conspiration or paranoia as a pretension for the infringement of civil liberties. That is yet another interpretation you could make concerning the Unlawful Societies Act, because there was already a piece of legislation that could have been used to stem the United Irishmen, Englishmen, and Scotsmen, and so on, which was called the Act Against the Unlawful Taking of Oaths, or something like that. So why even bother to bring up a legislation that not only targets specific organizations, but that definitely targets Freemasonry? And I mean, of course, from today's perspective, we could say, well, great, Freemasonry was exempted, but under regulations that by today's standards definitely could be called infringements, because Freemasons were obliged to hand in the list of their lodge members to the clerk of peace in the different counties. And also there was some discussion about that, if at all it was allowed to establish new lodges and so on. So I mean, it was not simply a success story that Freemasonry was exempted. To the contrary, one could argue it was not at all a story of success. The exemption, of course, was great, but I mean, the infringement of the freedom of association was pretty tough. One can argue, if you read the legislation closely, which also applies to the Prussian legislation, which also exempts Freemasonry, but basically places this under governmental observation. So to finish up, looking at the entire topic again from the perspective of overlapping diplomacies and interpreting Freemasonry as soft politics. Well, during the 1770s and 1780s, Freemasonry in Sweden is identified as a means to exercise influence in European affairs by soft politics. Sweden had lost its status as a military great power at the latest after the death of King Charles XII in 1718. So 6 decades previously, Sweden's status as a great power, a Baltic great power, had disappeared. So during the 18th century, Sweden tried to reinvent its foreign policy and first came up with natural sciences and Carl von Linné, and then later on with some other initiatives, Freemasonry being one of them, at least among the high aristocracy. And the image you can see here is, for instance, a patent for the formation of a Russian province under Swedish rule that was signed by Duke Charles in the 1780s. So Sweden wanted to exercise some influence, both in the old German Empire, but definitely around the Baltic Sea, and try to use Freemasonry and, a higher degree, chapter chivalric Freemasonry to make the parts of the governing elites of this part of Europe at least friendly with Swedish interests. However, following the geopolitical realignment, Sweden develops a stronger interest in Britain during the 1790s. And the Swedish rapprochement in terms of Freemasonry is part of such a campaign of establishing trust between the two kingdoms when the French Revolution has basically destroyed the Swedish-French alliance, when the armies of the French Republic are crushing every other army in Europe, and where for one moment Britain looks like the power that can guarantee the re-establishment of a European order. And Sweden wants to align itself with Britain in that process. So was it intentional that Duke Charles wrote that letter to the Prince of Wales in 1798? Maybe, but maybe not. Most likely unintentionally, it contributed to the exemption of Freemasonry from prohibition and infringement of freedom of assembly. But on the other hand, one interpretation that I'm proposing in my paper is that one could also say that by writing this letter to the Prince of Wales, the Duke Charles says to his royal brother in Britain that we are under attack, we need to unite, we are experiencing a time of crisis. And if we don't unite, we might vanish, because the French Revolution demonstrates to all the conservative and reactionary people in Europe that a voluntary association and assembly is no good for human societies. Whereas Freemasonry, of course, believes the contrary, that voluntary association is a natural part of civil society, and that it has a role to play in society. So I propose in my paper that you could interpret the writing of that very letter as a very conscious act from the Swedish side, but with the unintended consequence of influencing British domestic legislation, but that again, a piece of legislation that has to be interpreted against the European background. And with that, I would like to thank for your attention. And I hope that I will meet you for fruitful discussion about this subject soon.